Okay guys, we're gonna start our guest lecture. So we have we have a guest speaker. He is from Illinois, so I think that we're gonna blame you partially for this cold weather. You brought
Cold?
well, it is cold for us. Yeah.
Oh my,
It is
I was
cold for us.
outside having a cigarette. I didn't get frostbite. I was just, thank you.
Well, it's cold for us. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. William Kline. He is professor of business ethics at the University of Illinois in Springfield. We're gonna get a great lecture on business ethics, transaction cost in business, right?
That'll be part of it, yes. What is business is actually my topic. And just a little bit about me. My undergraduate degree was in economics, actually in Austrian economics. But since I took so little math, I couldn't go into grad school in econ. I went on to philosophy, but I maintained a love for economics and sort of a groovy. Took game theory and concentration in econ through grad school. And it just so happens, and this is the way careers go, I ended up at a school where I taught 2 intro philosophy courses and 2 business ethics courses. None of my fellow philosophers liked the business ethics courses. I loved it. I love business students. I love the business school. I love business. And so I ended up teaching 4 courses a semester in business. And well, here I am today. I'm actually in business school and I'm in charge of business ethics. So today's topic, and one that interests me greatly, is what is business? And the history behind this, and I'll talk more about him in a second, but if you, The Firm, the Market, and the Law by Ronald Coase, in the very beginning, when he's talking about why he has a seminal article on the nature of the firm, he says that the only concept more foggy than the firm is the concept of the market. And I read that years ago, and I thought, well, there's a research project. I know Coase was writing in the 40s, but you'd be surprised how few people actually devote their attention to such questions. There are some, but how few do. And it's within that context that I started to get interested in what is business. And I was actually asked to write an article for a business ethics encyclopedia, which is what I'm taking this lecture from. So a couple of things about why to be interested in business, or what business is. One of them, you're at Loyola. It's a Catholic university, Jesuit university. Not to say that you're Catholic or Jesuit, but it is, and you may get this in your business ethics course. But there was a bishop's encyclical back in '86. And 2 of the fundamental propositions that the Catholic Church put forward is that the 2 fundamental values when it comes to dealing with economics is stewardship of resources and dignity of the person. Now, how they apply that's way different than how I apply that. But what I want to suggest is that some of what I have to say here has direct relevance to that, as you encounter that maybe at Loyola. The second reason, and as economists or econ students, one of the things that interests me is when I get this feeling that there's a gap. And I'm giving another paper today at a conference too, but there's a bit of a gap in business. Coase sensed it, or in econ, Coase sensed this, that all these graphs, all these notions of self-interested individuals interacting, reacting to supply and demand, narrowing the difference curves, the budget lines, we get prices. And one of the things that has fascinated me is exactly how that comes about, the nitty-gritty, not just at the theoretical level, not just at the model level, but really on the ground, how it is that prices come about. And you find that in business, right? Of course, consumers interacting with business, but most often it's a business enterprise that will set the asking price for something, and how they go about doing that, what that entails, what that involves, is fascinating to me. And that brings up the final point too. It's businesses doing this en masse that give us price signals, and that's going to be actually very important for the paper too. So, on to what is business. So, if you've taken a business ethics class or you're about to take a business ethics class, the first thing you will notice is the instructor will assume that they know what business is, flat out. The only thing we have to talk about is what ethics is, and then once we get the ethical theories out there, or the correct ethical theory out there, then we go through and we just say what everything is wrong. this is immoral, that's wrong. It's the typical, not too often in a business ethics class do business get praised, not too often do you talk about the virtues of business. No, what you're going to do is get the ethical theory straight. Ethics trumps whatever this thing called business is, which everybody knows because we use the term, and then we're all happy ever after. And one of my points is that that's actually very misguided, because what your notion of business is actually influences what you think the ethics should be. So it's not an independent variable, right? The two are very much dependent upon each other. So if you think the business is by nature exploitative, if you're a Marxian, your ethical solutions or your ethical paradigm that you apply to business is going to be much different than, say, somebody who thinks that a business constitutes a win-win scenario. And the ethical structure they think that's needed to ensure that in wrong behavior, right? If you think, whatever you think of business, you can have religious views of business, you can have, there's tons out there, I don't get to cover them all in here. So one of the reasons why I want to do this is, especially when you go into business ethics, feel free to challenge your instructor just a little bit. Push back a little bit. There'll be assumptions there about business. Now the assumptions that you'll hit as an econ student, and I just want to briefly go through these, but the assumptions that you'll hit as a business student, well, might come from transaction cost theory, all right? So one of the things I want to go through very quickly is why I don't think that at least this branch of economics has a good answer. So if you read somebody like Coase, right, and they say that going out into the market is expensive, because you have to find people, you have to find what they're willing to work for, you have to negotiate with them. And if I have to do that with 1,000 different individuals in 1,000 different places, that's going to cost a lot. So one of the ways that we reduce those transaction costs is we bring everybody within the firm. We bring them under managerial control, we form a hierarchy, and then we can sort of have like a mini command order within a market system, and that eases transaction costs. Now there's something to that. I'm not saying that that's not why people group and clump, but the problem with Coase is that Coase wants to locate the notion of a firm with discretionary authority in contracts. So basically he says that the difference between a business basically in the market is that when we form a contract in the firm, I have discretionary authority. So basically I hire you to do job X, and you sign off to basically obey my commands within the parameters of the contract. And that's what's going to really be the key to the firm. The problem with this notion is that it's a bit too loose. I'm not saying that that's not important, that discretionary authority isn't important, but if also from the transaction cost literature you look at it, and one of the central and fundamental premises is all contracts are incomplete. You can't fully specify, right? This is why we have managers have fiduciary obligations, so that you cannot fully specify every aspect of the job, every detail. So every contract is incomplete. What that ends up meaning in the real world is that every contract then involves discretionary authority to some degree. So for instance, if you hire a cleaner, right? So, and I go out in the market and do this, right? So it's sort of a Coasean market transaction. It's not a firm. I go out, I get a cleaner, I stipulate all the jobs that he or she needs to do, I stipulate the price, they come and they do them. But then here's the problem, right? And this is always the problem, we'll do this a little bit later. I can't monitor everything the cleaner does. So certain things are very important to me, and I monitor and make sure that that cleaner does well in the bathroom, let's say. I want to make sure my bathroom's clean, I got a phobia. But other things, dusting the blinds, the top of the door, maybe sweeping behind a certain thing that I don't care about, I don't monitor. Well, guess what? She has discretionary authority over that. It's her standards that then get applied to that, or his standards that then get applied to that. So even in market transactions, this notion of discretionary authority, I don't think it just exists within the firm. I think it exists within just regular market contracts as well. There's a bit of leeway, a bit of fuzziness. So Coase's, what he focuses on is discretionary authority stuff I just don't think is enough. What that leads to when we talk about incomplete contracts and discretionary authority is a branch. And you know what, and I'm welcome for feedback on this because I'm struggling with it. I would say it's a branch of transaction cost theory, but it might be its own thing called agency theory. And agency theory is just basically when you're going to worry about people not doing what you said, right? You hire them, and how many have seen this, right? You're waiting to get on a ride at some amusement park, or you're waiting to take your order, and what's the person doing? They're texting. And you're like, really? Seriously? This happened to me in St. Louis at the Arch. I waited like 3 minutes. Like, where's the boss? That's precisely it, right? So even within the firm, once contracts are made, it's not like now you have zero costs of enforcement of that contract. You as the boss, you as the manager have to oversee this. And so we run into this thing where a range of agency theorists, whether it be, let's see, Jensen and Meckling. If you want any of these names, or I can give a copy of this paper to anybody who wants it. But a host of authors who say, well, what really separates the firm from the market is this notion of somehow monitoring and enforcement. And that can be through people shirking, or it can just be through, you know, think of it this way, there's a real problem. How many people in here have had group projects in their classes? Yeah. How many people like the group projects? All right, one. All right, those of you who didn't like them, why don't you like them? Go for it.
Because, well, Dr. Crouch on statistics class, I want all the 5 points of the graphs for myself. I don't really want to share. And so I work hard, not necessarily everyone else does.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
It's hard to like depend on other people to put in there.
That's right. Your group projects or agency theory apply. That one person who realizes that you ain't all going to fail because they're not doing anything. They're like, and especially in those environments, and I don't know how it's, you know, right here, but I know professors who are like, no, you have to deal with it intra-group, so there's no enforcement mechanism from above. So basically that person negotiates a little bit of brinkmanship and says, look, we can all fail, or you can just assign me to C for doing nothing, and you guys have to pick up the extra slack. And boom, right there. And it's the job of the firm, according to some of these theorists, to monitor and make sure that that doesn't happen, that kind of shirking. And even when people are all contributing together, now like think if I was paying you, right? So maybe now there's a little bit more incentive for me to monitor. But even if I'm paying you, how do I separate out like the person who contributed the most in the group versus the least in the group? That's not an easy task. So even that requires monitoring. Even that makes me, or puts a burden on me to keep track of. And I find this area of economics very interesting. Like I said at the very beginning, I'm a philosopher by training. How many people have had a philosophy class? Great. Y'all read The Republic? Remember reading The Republic? Remember reading about that Ring of Gyges thing where the guy turns invisible, goes and kills the king? How many remember that? No? 2, yeah. Glaucon in book 2. He says, hey, Socrates, you think everybody wants to be just. What if we give him a ring of invisibility? Look at this Greek shepherd. He gets this ring of invisibility, immediately realizes what it can do. And then he takes a letter to the king, seduces the queen, kills the king, becomes the king of the kingdom. So my argument is actually the first agency theorist was Plato 2,000 years ago. And it's right. It's a problem of self-interest. It's a problem of defective. And it's a real problem. Unfortunately, what happens and what will happen in your business ethics classes is that people will say things like, well, that just assumes everybody's selfish and evil. They're not. They're either made in God's image, or there's a lot of good people out there. So it's this faulty model that generates this sort of hypersensitivity to defection. It's the model that makes people evil, not that people were evil in and of themselves. And there's something to that. I think that the way we frame problems, the way that we look at issues, does color the solutions. Once again, what you think business is will color your solutions in ethics. There is something to that. But what you really have to realize is that this notion of monitoring within the firm can happen even among good people. Right? You can put 5 good, look at any nonprofit and put a committee together. No, don't put a committee together. But let's just say, put a committee together. Well, 5 different people can have 5 different ideas of 5 different ways to spend the money, right? It's all about interest divergence. It doesn't just have to be my interest. You could want to help one thing, you could. So how do we monitor and make sure that we all get on the same page and we all coordinate and cooperate, right? On the same page. So I think agency theory has an insight with the monitoring, but I don't think it relies on thinking everybody's selfish. You'll of course find this with people critiquing economics too. Oh, you just think everybody's selfish. And it's not. It's your interest, your preference. They could be other regarding preference. They could be same regarding preference. But when they diverge, we have a problem, especially within the firm, and we have to get everybody on the same page. And I think there's a rich story there. A rich story for ethics and a rich story for business. But the problem is once again, this doesn't distinguish business from anything else. Nonprofits, churches, businesses, the military, they all have these monitoring problems. So if we were looking for something to separate out business, from something else, the economic arguments of transaction cost theory, whether it's authority in a contract, or whether it's this notion of monitoring within the firm, really doesn't tell us what business is. It might tell us 1 or 2 things business does, but then so does everybody else. So we have to go beyond that. That's the philosopher inside of me. I'll cue you up right now. I mean, that's like, you've got to go beyond that. There has to be something else. So when we start looking at it, what is the something else? Well, we could look at it, and interestingly enough, when we think of business, you could think of business as an organization or business as an activity. Okay? And I think that gets kind of mixed in the transaction literature. Sometimes they're talking about organizations, the firm, sometimes they're talking about activities like monitoring. And by the way, if you want to ask a question at any point in this, please feel free to just raise your hand. I'll get back on track and answer what I can. And one of the problems with looking at business as an organization is, once again, you don't find anything that really defines business as such. One of the favorite things, once again, if you're doing business ethics, is to talk about corporate social responsibility, or the ethical obligations of corporations. It's rampant. You read the business ethics literature and you wouldn't think that any other type of business exists almost. It's all about corporations. And that's rather interesting, why that would be the case. Why this assumption? Why is it the corporations that matter and not the rest of businesses? And there's actually 2 different assumptions that go into this. The first assumption that you'll hear, people kind of throw off as a one-liner. Adam Smith, not a strange name to you all, is it? No. So what they'll say is something like the following. They'll say, well, we're not in Adam Smith's world of small shopkeepers. That is, from whatever notion they have of Adam Smith and whatever notion they have of, say, a perfectly competitive economy, they know that a well-functioning price system requires lots of competitors. Now, when that doesn't happen, then we're going to have problems of various economic and possibly ethical sorts. So I say, we're not living in his world of small shopkeepers, where we now have massive conglomerates, massive businesses so big, right? Adam Smith could not have conceived. People had over 500,000 employees. And Smith could have never envisioned this. Find similar arguments about, by the way, about the Constitution and whatnot, but in this case, since he didn't envision this, whatever lessons he had in the Wealth of Nations really don't quite apply now, because what we have is these huge islands of power, and they influence prices and they influence wages in a way that does not reflect what a competitive market would look like. And in fact, it reflects what power asymmetries look like and all the problems that people have with power. And I'm actually going to come to that, back to that in a minute. So, well, what do we say to that? Is it true or false? Well, one day I just got upset with this, and so I went to the business census data. And they used to, and there's actually a lot of government websites, or several I know of, that have done this. They used to post things in like nice charts. Like you could just look at it. It was almost like an Excel spreadsheet. The data is a little bit more difficult to look at now. But if you go and you look at businesses' employment numbers, right? How many businesses are that big? And how many businesses aren't? A couple interesting things you find. First of all, business census data don't count self-employed people as employing anybody. So if you go to work for yourself, you're not employing anybody. So there's a 0 in the column, which is a joke, because what? You're employing yourself. I don't understand why that falls off. And it's a big number. I haven't looked at it recently, but it's actually a big number. The reason I say that is because if you include self-employed, it is employing yourself. The cutoff is that equal, about 500 employees, firms that are 500 employees and smaller versus firms that are 500 employees and bigger. And you can look this up, and people have written about it. It's about 50-50. So about half of the jobs out there, right, are not in huge conglomerates. And 500 isn't that much. I mean, 500 would be larger than maybe a mom and pop store, but it's certainly not AT&T or Google. You'd be surprised how easy it is to hit that number. So I come back and say, well, look, you're telling me that there are these large corporations, and that's true, but half of the jobs out there, because usually that's what's important to these types of people, are by smaller businesses. 51 million people, I think, employed by that. So, yeah, there are firms out there that are larger than Smith ever thought possible, but there's a number of small firms out there that Smith would have never conceived of. Everything's bigger. There's a lot of small shopkeepers out there. All right? Now, it'll depend on the, okay, not in automobiles or whatever, but still, it should give us pause that we focus solely on corporations and yet only half of the working population is employed by them. So you should at least give pause. The second thing that's usually given for focusing on corporations in business ethics, as that's the important business to focus on, is the disproportionate effect that they have. And there is something to this, right? So, you look at Detroit, the car plant closes, thousands of people go unemployed. I'm from southwestern Pennsylvania, right? When the mines and the mills shut down, Pittsburgh went from a city of 900,000 to a city of 300,000. And if you go outside of Pittsburgh, especially west and Panhandle of West Virginia, southeastern Ohio, it's just downright spooky. One mine, one town, mine closes, everything closes. The stores, schools, boarded up houses, they're like ghost towns, like in the Old West. And this is the kind of thing people were thinking about, and it exists and it's real, right? When Union Carbide has an accident in Bhopal, India, thousands die because of their chemicals. All right, that is not going to happen with the local hardware store. I give you that. But the problem is how they compare. Because when you're talking about ethics, when you're talking about law, or when you're talking about some sort of political solution, it doesn't just apply to one firm. Right? So, corporations have a disproportionate effect, therefore we should focus on them and then ignore the others. But the problem is the law applies to everybody. It's never the case of one mom and pop and one giant corporation. Oh, which should I worry about? Okay, yeah, the corporation. It's thousands of mom and pop shops. And the example that I use in the paper and that I've used elsewhere is, if you look at, so in 2007, Mattel was outsourcing some of the production of its toys to China. And I don't know if anybody remembers this, but lead paint was found in the toys. And the reason you put lead in paint is it brightens the colors. It's not like they were just evil. They may have been evil too, but bright colors, lead's one way to make colors bright. So they find this in Mattel's supply chain, and it's kids, and it's lead, and people lose their minds. All right? Now it's bad, don't get me wrong, but kind of like asbestos, it's not going to hurt you unless it's chipping off and you're eating it, right? So once you do the recall, but people are still like, ah. So we need to pass a law. So they actually passed the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. There's a mouthful, CPSIA, that mandates a whole range of testing now for toys. Expensive testing. Well, who can, anybody do public choice in here? Oh, you should. So who can afford that testing? Mattel. Mattel's actually advocating for it. Who can't? All these sort of granola, crunchy, patchouli-wearing, Vermont-based wooden toy makers, and there are a lot out there. And they had to have, they don't even use paint. They had to do all the same testing that Mattel did. The same tests were applied to them. And a number of them went out of business. And I have citations for this. And nobody even noticed. It wasn't one toy maker. It wasn't one small toy maker. It was many people's livelihoods. I don't know exactly how many people were unemployed. That'd be another paper I'd like to maybe do. But it had a big impact. The beautiful thing about this is an aside, by the way. The beautiful thing about this in public outrage, and we need to pass a law, what nobody noticed then is, so the government says you have to have your products tested by a third-party tester to make sure your toys are safe. Now that sounds right, doesn't it? Right? That's why you have somebody proctoring your exam. Mattel lobbied and won. Mattel says, well look, in-house we have all those testing procedures. We shouldn't have to outsource it. We should be able to do it in-house because we have the capacity. And then we'll just show you to pay for it. And the government said, that's fine. If you have the capacity to do it in-house. Right? So in the political realm, I get why corporations matter. Right? Don't get me wrong. But when we're going to talk about business ethics and the effects of certain laws or the effects of ethical actions or supposedly ethical actions, I don't see why this focus on large corporations. Because what happens is a law that, and this happens a lot, a law you think would just apply to large corporations. Walmart should have to pay the minimum wage. Walmart may be able to pay that. Walmart may not end up laying a lot of people off because of that. The smaller firms are going to get hit in the teeth with it. I'm convinced that's one of the things that happened to independent bookstores in New York City with the Americans with Disability Act. If I'm a Barnes & Noble with 5 floors and I have to make my aisles wheelchair accessible, I have to reduce stock because I have to take out bookshelves and I have to, but that's fine. They still have a hell of a lot of space and a hell of a lot of stock. What, they reduce 10% of their stock, 20% maybe on a high day. What if I have, I don't know if you've ever been to a used bookstore, but you know, I have a used bookstore and some of those used bookstores you could just get through because everything for sale was in there. That's everything, that's what they're selling, it's everything they own. You ask me to take out 2 rows of bookshelves, that's half my inventory. I can't do that. I can't do that on New York rents when I go out of business. Right? So people looking at big companies and saying they can afford that, ignoring the small companies who can't, I think actually leads to disastrous results. So once again, focusing on the large corporation because they have more impact. Well, the only reason that somebody can think that in the economic realm is simply because they're just not looking at the other half of the economy. And they're ignoring the fact that laws and regulations will apply to everybody, for the most part. So once again, this notion that corporations somehow define business or what business is extremely problematic and deserves pushback in your business ethics classes. There's family businesses, there's small businesses, and those deserve our attention too. They're interesting in a variety of ways. So if I want to try and figure out what business is, looking at either economics or looking to business ethics literature and just focusing on the corporation, neither of those seem to work. So in my head, and I haven't constructed an exhaustive list, I'll be honest, you might have an idea and you're like, oh, you didn't consider this, that's fine, bring it on, we'll talk about it. But in my mind and from what I've seen, it's not the organizational structure that's going to define what a business is. You know, Gordon Tullock talks about hierarchies. Well, there's a lot of hierarchies out there. There's a lot of legal forms, limited partnerships, single ownership, whatever. I mean, nothing there is going to define business versus non-business in the organizational structure. So what's going to have to be is activity. What does business do? What do business people do? And this is a great area too, because once again, if you're in business ethics, often the instructor and many people will simply assume that the business people are just out there to, and pardon me, screw you. I had a a friend of mine telling me that the perfect product would be the product that breaks all the time, but everybody thinks is the greatest product in the world, so they keep buying it. I'm not sure how those two things go together, but it's amazing how often people will think that. Right? That would be the best product. And by the way, go back and read The Republic, because when Glaucon's talking about that ring of Gyges thing, he actually says the best way to be is to seem good. Everybody thinks you're a great person, but in reality, you're a backstabbing, ladder climbing, self-aggrandizing SOB. That's the best way to live. So once again, these have reflections of what business people are supposed to be doing in the minds of many. Is somehow this notion of what they're really out to do is short the consumer, short the employee in ways that don't look like that, and then take all that gain for themselves. So we've got to really go back and look then, well, what is the activity of business? And I'm going to mix it up from here in my paper just a little bit, because I want to get to the central thing. And I get into arguments with my colleagues in the business department quite often, so I'm willing to say this is a debatable point. But it's not profit. Profit's important, and we'll get to that. But like the distinguishing thing is they make a profit. And it kind of wounds me because profit's a result of doing something, right? Profit's the score at the end. Profit's the tracking of costs and revenues. Profit isn't, I don't do profit. I kind of like, that would be kind of a neat band name, right? Or something, you know, let's do profit. I don't know what that means. Yesterday I was profiting. Really? What did that involve? So it's not really an activity. Profit is the result of activity. I think that's really important, especially in the business ethics courses, but even in econ, to get, people are doing something to earn a profit or a loss. And it's that we have to get at. It's that we need to drill down into to figure out both questions about ethics and I think questions that are relevant to economics as well. Now, first problem, when we're doing that, business activity isn't just like, I'm jumping, I'm winded. I'm an academic. I play pool, I bowl, nothing aerobic. So what is it? I mean, how are we going to pick out these activities? And one of the things that we find very quickly is that activities in the business world especially are defined by rules. They don't just exist in nature. We've socially constructed them. And so you look at contracts, right? Think about this. I'm forgetting the name now. HLA Hart talks about this. What constitutes the signing of a contract? Well, where you sign, how many times you sign, where you have to initial, that's all conventional, legal, historical, all in an attempt to make sure that when you put your signature down, it's not just a scribble, it's actually a legally binding sign. That once you do that, when your signature goes in that specific place, right, in that specific form, you are now obligated by law to do certain actions. The signing of a contract is not just writing your name. It's writing your name within a web of rules and understandings. And you won't understand this now, but when you buy a house, I want you to remember this. Because at the 25th signature, you'll be like, son of a, really? I just 4 times? Okay. And that's why. Right? It's a very complicated act. So what we find, and we find people, and we find economists who recognize this too, like North recognizes the importance of institutional structures. If you'll give me 1 second here. I'll turn over. It's a great quote, so that's why I want to find it. And if I can't find it in 1 second, I'll come back to it. Yeah, Douglas North. I couldn't remember his first name. A hierarchy of rules constitutional, statute law, common law, together will define the formal structure of rights in a specific exchange. Moreover, a contract will be written with enforcement characteristics of exchange in mind. Because of the costliness of measurement, most contracts will be incomplete, remember I said that. Hence, informal constraints will play a major role in the actual agreement. These will include reputation, broadly accepted standards of conduct, and conventions that emerge from repetitive interaction. So, the thing is, and this bothers ethicists and bothers philosophers, like philosophers and ethicists like things very neat. And this is messy. It's historically bound. There's not one convention. There's not one law. Hell, there's not even one regulation sometimes. Right? All of these merge together to define a specific activity as having a specific meaning, as doing something specifically. All right? So if we want to ask what business is, and if business is an activity, one of the things we do have to turn our attention to is the rules. The rules that define that activity. Now the rules that I think that define that activity, and I will argue for, once again, if you wish to argue back, that's great, are property and voluntary trade. Right? Now, to the messiness question, talk to any of your friends who go to law school in first year law. Property law, hate it. Why? Why? It's centuries of common law and then all statutes and regulations on top of that. In an effort to figure out what property rights are. Who owns what? Voluntary trade's the same thing. Contract law. There's one that people love. Everybody gets excited about it. Well, not everybody. Okay? Most people hate it. One or two people are like, I'm going into corporate law. Okay, knock yourself out. But contract law is another one. Why is it so complicated? Well, once again, just as North said, these are historically bound institutions. They're messy. There are gaps, there are holes. It's not perfect, but in this case, and I don't know what, I'll have to look back with Blackstone, right? We're talking several centuries of people trying to work out what constitutes a binding voluntary trade or a binding contract, what constitutes property rights. And the reason I bring these two rules up is because what I wish to offer you today to think about for your consideration is that, remember I said profit isn't an activity, profit's a result. But profit can also be in the intent, right? People go into something to make money. So what I want to offer to you is that business activity is actually producing a good or service for trade with the intent to profit. Now, producing, I don't mean manufacturing. And by the way, in the wonderful case of Schadenfreude, I have to tell, in a previous job that I no longer work for, the chair of the business department was not very nice to me when I brought this forward. And I said, that's fine, I'll get it published. And I did. I wanted to send her a copy, but I'm like, no, I'll just leave that alone. But producing a good or service for trade, right, with the intent to profit. Now, producing here means like producing evidence. I have it. I have something that I can, whether it's my labor, whether it's a good service, I can produce for trade. So now we have, remember what I said about property and voluntary, right? So in order to legitimately produce something, I have to own it, or it's within my means to own. There could be a contractual train of events, right? Sometimes people can't sell houses to other houses are sold and stuff like that. But there has to be a clear line of ownership. Otherwise, it's illegitimate. And if it's illegitimate like that, it's not a market activity, it's not a business activity. It's criminal or negligent, right? This is why I hate the phrase making money. Don't use this phrase, making money. Because what it seems, and people will use it like this, is if I mug an old lady or I take your money, I just made money. That's what business is all about. No, you fool. Business is very institutionally defined. You can't steal when doing business. If you steal, you're stealing. Anybody see the movie Goodfellas? Oh, beautiful movie. I love it. Section of that movie drives me insane though. The restaurant person comes to Paulie and asks him for help, for enforcement help with contracts. And Paulie, who's the head of the mafia, says okay. And now Ray Liotta, who's playing the lead character, talks about what happens. He's like, if you have a problem with contracts, if you have a problem with labor, if you have a problem with suppliers, you come to Paulie. In return, Paulie wants his money every month. Right? Oh, lightning struck the place. F you, give me my money. And he goes through this whole thing, like my wife was sick, F you, business down, F you, give me my money. And so then what ends up happening at the end is they leech the business dry. They take out loans they never intend to repay. So they buy liquor off of whatever equity the restaurant had, right? They get these loans, they'll buy $100,000 worth of liquor, they take the liquor in the front door and sell it out the back door for $10. And Liotta says, what's the difference? It's all profit. Like, no, that's not profit. You're stealing. You don't intend to pay the loan. So you buy a $30 bottle of liquor with loan money, you send it for $10 hard cash. You got money in your pocket, yeah, absolutely. But that's a business, and that's certainly not a profit, because profit, once again, isn't something that just reigns in nature, it's institutionally defined. That's making money, but that's certainly not business. And as economists, as business majors, I really encourage you to get outraged when you hear crap like that. Right? Because this is your institution. People badmouth a church, people badmouth a nonprofit, people badmouth a school, people get all sports team. What do you mean? It's the Saints, whatever. I'm the Steelers. And yet when people like have these weird notions of what business is some sort of rapacious theft, sucking people dry. Business people don't say anything. And then you wonder why you get the short end of the stick in legislation, regulation, public opinion. Gotta think about what business is. Not just about the right thing to do, but the activity that you are engaging in. It isn't that. It's producing a good or service for trade. So producing is you actually legitimately own it for trade with the intent to profit. So what you're doing then is what? And I love this, right? So, hold on, I'll do it with this. Who's talkative in here? Who's outgoing? Who's not? You're not. You might be. I'm going to set this here. Would you hold that for me? Whose quarter is that? Whose quarter is that?
I reckon it's yours.
That's my quarter. All right? She was holding it. It's my quarter. Now and I mean this. This is yours. Boop. Whose quarter is it now?
Hers.
Ah! What's the difference?
Transfer of ownership.
I transferred the property right to it. To me, that's one of the greatest mysteries in the market and in business. It's not just trading that good or service, it's trading the rights to it. It's not until those rights have passed, right? Now, I could do other things, right? We can have lease options, we can have homeowners agreements, right? Where it doesn't mean that I always get to do whatever I want with the product that I buy, but there's a host of rights that trade stands as well. And in a voluntary trade, there's a host of restrictions. I have to make sure somebody's old enough, of the right mind, and there could be actually even a host of other considerations that would mainly, I didn't have a gun to your head. That would just be so bad because I'd be on videotape too. It's just so awful. Do you want to keep the quarter?
Doesn't matter.
Well, you're an econ student.
Just give it to me if you want it.
Do you give that back to me?
Yes.
All right, so it's my quarter again. I have had students, that's why I use quarters. I used to use dollars. And some of the students who had read Plato would be like, mine now. It's like, all right, I'm going to use quarters. So, producing good or service for trade, right, involves property rights and the rules of voluntary trade. Now, I have an intent to profit. And people focus on that with this sort of maniacal, like they just lose it. Like somehow that makes the enterprise evil. But what I want to point out is the intent doesn't really define business activity. That's just kind of the engine. That's the spark. I want to get a little bit more. And I figured that I could make this and whatever my costs and time, et cetera, are, if you're going to give me more money than I put into it. So yeah, we'll do it, right? And actually, if you think about it, business is solving problems other people are willing to pay for. And I find that wonderful. You can solve problems people aren't willing to pay for all the time. Have kids. But in business, you're trying to find problems that people value enough that they'll give you something in return for what you give them. It's problem solving. Not rapaciousness, not theft, not, it's doing that. But now here's the question. How do you figure out if it pays? And I get excited about this because remember, I'm one of the people who likes this sort of historically bound, here we go. This historically bound, messy, conventional, cultural, rule-oriented activity that we call business. So if you intend to profit, you need a baseline, don't you? I need to figure out what my costs were. And I need to figure out what my revenues are. And so I've actually become really interested in the history of accounting. Accounting isn't something like, oh, I do business and then I got to report to the damn accountants. No, accounting is actually fundamental to this. If you really intend to make a profit and you intend to abide by at least one of the rules of the market, that is property rights, you have to do accounting. And if you look at people who write on the history of accounting, you find actually that they recognize this about accounting. I wish it crossed over more to business ethics. But there's two functions accounting has. One, time-specific events to resource depletion or increase, right? So money most of the time. And that's the numbers we write in the debit and the credit columns. And we all do that. But the second thing accounting has to do is not just the numbers. I got to remember who I owe those numbers to. Accounting is fundamental for respecting property rights. Right? Who's my account payable to? Who's that account receivable from? It's not just the money, it's those rights we just exchanged. Who do I go to for that specific claim? And if you then go and look at it, you find that brought cross cultures and prehistory. This blew my mind. There's a good argument to be made that accounting predates writing. We were accountants before we were writing. And the archaeological evidence is Schmidt-Besser, I think her name is. Once again, if you're interested in this, you can look this up and Google it. It's on Amazon. But archaeologists were like confused because they kept finding in archaeological digs like little squares, little cones, little 3D things made out of clay. And every so often they'd find a pot that would have a cone on it or a pot that would have a square on it. I had no clue. She figured out what it was. It's at least the earliest system of credits and debits we know. Right? So I would have a pot for a person, and I would put stuff in it. I guess if I owed, would take stuff out if they owed. But it was, I'm not sure entirely of the mechanics. I admit I glossed over how, kind of like I did when I was in accounting classes. But the point of the matter is that in fact these were the earliest known methods we find, and they predate writing, of three-dimensional representations of credits and debits of business activity. Accounting isn't, like when I say accounting, people think double entry bookkeeping. And if you go back, double entry bookkeeping roughly starts in the 1400s. A guy named Lucas Piccoli, and I'm probably mispronouncing his name, my apologies to all Italians up there, but he's the guy who writes about double entry bookkeeping and advocates it and gets it spread across Western Europe. And people think that's the invention of accounting, but that's wrong, because before Piccoli, there was actually single entry bookkeeping. Merchants did keep track, it just wasn't all that neat, and it was hard to sum things up. But merchants still kept track. And Piccoli's double entry bookkeeping that sweeps across Western Europe, do you know where he gets his ideas for that? It's from Arabic and Hindu practices that already exist concurrently in his time. So we have this wonderful historically rich, culturally rich record of this notion of accounting that both keeps track of resources and keeps track of ownership. Now the classical liberal me, keeping track of the ownership, I'm just like, wow, that's right. That's just right. You got to keep track of who owns what, or you're stealing. But that other side, remember what I said at the beginning, that bishop's encyclical in your business ethics class? Stewardship of resources and dignity of the person. I love people who think they can steward resources without keeping track. They just have an idea. Loyal, save it. I will not tell you all, I'm on video camera. What does that even mean? You have some rough idea that there's something out there that should be preserved. That tells me nothing. I have no baseline to work from. I don't know what more or less is. I will submit this to you. I will submit that Adam Smith, in conjunction with accounting, predates and is actually the original form of stewardship. People want to talk about sustainability. Fine. How do you know something's sustainable? Well, am I putting more into it than I'm getting out of it? That doesn't sound sustainable to me. I'll wear myself out or I'll deplete my resources and it'll be done and gone. How do I want to make sure it's sustainable? I want to make sure that I use less than I get out of it. I want to make sure my costs are lower than my revenues. That's sustainability. Now, I know that there are reasons why people won't like that version, but I will put that out there. I mean, accountants should be front and center on all these other things with sustainability, because it's by their methods that they figure out how to accurately use resources. I don't have a 2-liter bottle with me here, and I'll end here in a second. But when I drink a lot of Diet Coke, when I was a younger man, the 2-liter bottles, the plastic was really thick. They had this plastic bottom on them, and there was a lot of plastic in those bottles. You pick up a 2-liter today, there's none of that, and it's actually like a balloon. Right? The plastic is so thin. Why? Well, that's been cutting down on the inputs. I want to cut down on costs. How little plastic can we get away with and still give the consumer the Diet Coke that they want? Now, does it happen everywhere all the time? I'm not going that far, but it happens way more than the opposition would think. It happens way more than people who have these vague notions about what the rapaciousness of business is, and yet have no idea what actual business people do, let alone account. Producing a good or service for trade with the intent to profit, if that's really what you're doing and you're in business, you got to keep track of it. That involves accounting. The other thing that I would talk about too, we are running out of time, is the whole notion of negotiation. Even if it's just walking away from a given price, that's still negotiation. It's kind of binary. I buy or don't buy. But if any of you have a chance to go overseas, or if any of you go to flea markets, which I just absolutely love, negotiation is part of that. Negotiation involves communication. And the reason I bring that up is because, once again, when people focus on this profit thing and self-interest, they start talking about how asocial or antisocial business activity is. And nothing could be further from the truth. Business requires an immense amount of communication, complicated communication. All the time. It's constant communication. Communication breaks down, you don't have a market, prices disappear. Right? That's what happened. You shut down the stock market. What did you just say to people? You can't talk to each other about the price of stocks. Boom, done. Right? So prices is a result of constant communication among various and sundry actors. Once again, I can get back into it if you have some questions about why ethicists might have some problems with that. But what I do want to get across is that producing good or service for trade with the intent to profit respects both the ethical rules and is compliance with the two ethical rules of property rights and contracts, which institutionally are part of the market. So to that extent, business activity is ethical, and to the extent that actually intending to profit requires you to keep track of resources and who owns them, that fundamentally involves accounting, key notions of sustainability that deserve to be mined, deserve to be championed by you or there, and then finally people will come back and say, well, this is a very non-communicative, very selfish 2-year-old me, I want, homo economicus, QED, you're wrong. And no, that's not quite true. When one looks at the dance and negotiations, one sees quite a community catered act.
To enforce it in the first place, because just because someone can survive an aggression, it doesn't mean that it's less wrong, or it's less of an aggression.
That's absolutely true. There's a range of assaults that you can survive that nonetheless are violations of, well, depends how we formulate it. I heard that at 6:30 this morning. This is a flashback. And I think you're right. Just because it's an assault that we can survive, it doesn't exonerate it. What I'm trying, and that goes over to the ethics side. So in business ethics, if we want to talk about, say, the non-aggression principle or something like that, I think that's really important. I have a quote by John Hasness that the market isn't, if you think about it, a market isn't necessarily just a place you go. A market is a set of rules that govern the transaction. When I go into Amazon, I'm in the market. Or if there's a whole range, I can do mail order. And really what defines that market is something like a set of non-aggression principles, whether it be not stealing or whatever else. And I think they're important to that. But what I'm just coming at it from a different angle. So what kind of bothers me is so there's a lot of professional ethics out there for accountants or lawyers. And I find almost zero esprit de corps for managers. They have no idea what they're doing. Nobody really knows. Everybody thinks they're useless middle people. And the same with business. There's no, you go back and you read Andrew Carnegie, right? And Carnegie says the whole reason I have to give when I die is because I was doing this, not but amoral thing called business, right? So in order to sort of get into heaven or do good in the world after I've amassed all this wealth, I have to be able to give it away. So this real notion that there's nothing special about business activity, either ethically, virtue-wise, or anything to be proud of, just kind of blows me away. So that's the way so when you're talking about the corporations and the smaller businesses, what I'm trying to show is that people who want to simply focus on the large corporations, because they're missing the point of what business is, are doing a lot of harm to a lot of smaller parties. They're doing harm to the larger parties too, because, right, I saw Bosky out on the board. It's the broken window fallacy. Whatever money I'm taking from the business doesn't get to use. I'm not quite sure how FAA fines work, but I always was amazed, right? Faulty wings found on American Airlines. They're fined $1 million by the FAA. I don't think the FAA gives that money back. So I'm like, well, couldn't they have used that $1 million for, then why didn't you mandate that $1 million be used for repairs? Right? Similarly, if I raise wage rates or pollution controls or whatever else, the money that goes into that comes out of something else. I just don't see it quite as clearly in the big corporations. And that I agree on. But the thing is that rhetorically people don't care when it comes to big corporations usually. So I guess there's also a rhetorical element of this. It's like, fine, even if you don't care, if you think AT&T is Satan on earth, look what it's doing to all the others. You can't ignore them. That's business too. Your law hits them. So could you just pull back for a second? Because people seethe, and once they get all frothy, they tend to and they ignore everything else. And I'm trying to back off from that a little bit. So yeah, you're right. There are rights against non-aggression, etc. And those do deserve examination. It just wasn't quite my avenue on this case. Yes?
Could you elaborate on the negotiation stuff that you said that you didn't go into?
I will. I want to do one quick aside. How many of you eat Ben & Jerry's ice cream? Good. It's delicious stuff, right? How many think Ben & Jerry's nice and wholesome? Cows, not really. Well, they give money back. They're on YouTube. They're all socially conscious. How many people think there's still a Ben & Jerry's, by the way?
There are.
No, there isn't.
I know they hired a new CEO.
Well, in a sense, they hired a new CEO, but this goes back to 2000. Who owns Ben & Jerry's? There is not an independent company called Ben & Jerry's.
Acquired by a bigger company.
Unilever, one of the largest multinational corporations in the world. I got to see the one who didn't have a heart attack talk. And I asked him in the talk, I'm like, why'd you sell it? If all this socially conscious stuff you said, because he lacks his panegyric. And he avoided the first time. I interrupted another questioner, asked him again, and he finally said, the money was obscene. It was too good. I just love that. But if you look on Ben & Jerry's, I think is actually almost criminalized because they bill themselves as some sort of small company. You cannot find out on the packaging that they're owned by Unilever.
Yeah, through their franchise statements or
Google it, you'll find it. But they still bill themselves as a small company. Socially conscious. Unilever I love. Ben & Jerry's not so much. The negotiation thing. Here's always the conflict, right? Ethicists, and I think even economists with models, oftentimes look at the real world and go, we have the model, whether it's an ethical model or a mathematical model of how perfect things work. And that's how it should be. And give no credit to the conventional practices that have arisen. On the other hand, you can give all the way to the conventional practices that have arisen, and there's a lot of good ones, but then what do you do with things like, I don't know, racism? Right? If all there is convention in the world, if all there is what people actually do, then what do you, how do you critique it anymore? So there's this fine balance. I find business ethicists in the main go with, here's my ideal rationalist model and I want to impose it on the world. One of the reasons they do is because negotiations by necessity involve information asymmetries, and on the basis of that alone, power asymmetry. But they can also involve other power asymmetries, right? I can be a large supplier, you can be a small buyer, vice versa. We're not all the same size, we don't all exercise the same influence. Not everything is as important to us, our preference structures differ. So all these accidental, and by the way, you say that to a moral theorist, they go nuts. Because there can't be moral accidents, right? Everything has to be sort of rationally, consistently good. You can't just luck out. This is why, like if you read people like Rawls or whatever, they talk about the natural lottery. Right? And some of us went out by having better abilities than other people. I just saw a picture of B.B. King on the wall, right? But he doesn't have a right to it because that was just a natural lottery. But once again, the natural practices or whatever have no weight whatsoever. Our redistributed models or whatever have all the. So in negotiations, all of these asymmetries, my asymmetries and your asymmetries, so we have to, so I use an old article by Hans Senholz that talks about diminishing marginal utility, right? You have 5 sacks of grain. If you only have 1 sack of grain, you fight to the death over it. If you have 5 sacks of grain, what Senholz doesn't bring into that article, what I try to is think, if somebody else comes up to trade, do we know how many they have? No. they're keeping that close to their chest, right? Whatever, however much of a supply they have, or how many sacks of grain that they have, and I'm sorry if that's a bit esoteric, but I don't know how much money they have coming up to me. I don't know how much resource stock they have coming up. I don't know how desperate they are, right? So, to me, in a perfect world, I'd know exactly your position, your bargaining position, because then I could drive you to the minimum that you're going to take. But because I don't know that, I can't, I can approximate it, I can maybe take a couple steps that way. But then you're going to push back. Because once again, you don't know all that information about me that's going to get the best deal for you. That drives ethicists crazy. That really, the quintessential example I use when, and sorry I brought up an article that nobody probably read, but it was very influential to me. I do apologize for that. But think of it this way. You go to a flea market or a garage sale. I love garage sales. How many go to garage sales? Oops, they don't do that. I love going to garage sales. And a lot of social justice warriors do too. Nobody walks up, you know, really. There's the book. Oh, I'd like to read that, 50 cents. You know, actually, in my preference structure, I'd really be willing to give you $2 for that. No, if any, I mean, I don't care what number they put on it. If it's 50 cents, I'm like, maybe we could use something to read on a trip. That's kind of moldy. How about a quarter? Right? That kind of drive. And now ask yourself, and this is very real, what do you do if you walk up and find somebody with a first edition book? What do you do if you walk up because of the certain knowledge you possess about whatever hobby you have, and this has happened to me, where you look at something and you're like, is that really the price? Very slowly, don't scare the bunny. Don't scare the bunny. It's $1. I'll offer them 75 cents, because sometimes if you just offer them the asking price, then they know you want to do that. So, am I obligated then to tell them? And that's a struggle people have to deal with, right? Am I obligated to tell you, yeah, that's really worth probably about $200 or whatever the case may be, and you're offering it for $1. Those kind of interactions really bother ethicists. So that's the one thing I wanted to say. Real world negotiations. Because sometimes you walk in and you're just at the short end of it. And that just happens. And so, yeah, they end up getting more value than you do. But you still ended up trading, so you're better off, supposedly, than you were before. I could imagine cases where maybe you wouldn't be, but by and large, and people don't like that. People don't. But also, too, what I wanted to say is that in negotiations, in a range of interactions, because negotiation isn't just about price either. It's about quality, time and place, all sorts of things that if you get into regular interactions with people, all those sympathies and stuff that Adam Smith talked about really do emerge. They really can emerge. Maybe not to the full extent of like a lover or whatever, but they definitely do. And if you start looking at the language in negotiation and the complicated dance that it is, I just don't know any other way to say it. It's just it's wonderfully complex. If it were poetry, nobody just looks at poetry. Well, not nobody. There are Philistines out there. Just a bunch of people writing words on pages. Right? If somebody says that about poetry, or this good poetry, or jazz, like my dad says, just a bunch of notes make no sense, because you don't understand. You don't have to like it. I'm not saying you have to like it. That's fine if you don't, but geez, that exhibits such an ignorance of what's going on. And yet when it comes to complex economic activities like negotiations, and people are like, yeah, it's just you trying to get what you want. Done. That's not important. Our ethical whatever can trump that and get rid of it. We can just ignore it because it's an evil process. I hear so many different just that's immoral. I don't know. It's just, it's mind-boggling the level of ignorance people will display towards those sorts of practices. And think then that they are in some position to make some sort of ethical judgment about it. You can be ignorant of a lot of things, but then when you're ignorant and want to be the king, it blows my mind. So yeah, I think that negotiation is a highly complex, communicative dance, like bees dancing, showing which way the pollen is. And it deserves far more examination by the humanities, and instead just gets written off.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.